Mahinda Rajapaksa, Sri Lanka's prime minister till a few days ago, has reportedly sought refuge at a naval base in Trincomalee. As thousands of angry protesters gathered outside his Colombo residence, Rajapaksa, it is said, was rescued by Sri Lankan troops in a dramatic pre-dawn operation Tuesday. This is your weekly fix. I'm Smitha Nair. Let's rewind a bit. On Monday, Mahinda Rajapaksa resigned as prime minister just hours after his supporters brutally attacked peaceful anti government protesters and burnt down tents. In the violence that ensued, the homes of ruling party politicians were attacked. 8 people were killed, at least 200 wounded. The violence that erupted across the country now threatens to thwart bailout talks with the International Monetary Fund, unless perhaps the resignation of Mahinda Rajapaksa paves the way for a national unity government to be formed. Well, there's been no consensus among political parties on this. The Sri Lanka Podujana Peramuna, or SLPP of the Rajapaksas, is the ruling party. Its coalition partner, Sri Lanka Freedom Party SLFP, says it is no longer part of the coalition. Sajid Premadasa's SJP is the main opposition party, but it doesn't have the numbers to form a government on its own. The SJB has thus far maintained that an all-party unity government under President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, Mahinda's younger brother, is a non-starter. Sri Lanka is facing its worst economic crisis since the island nation became independent in 1948. Faced with crippling shortages of fuel, food, medicine, lengthy power blackouts, Sri Lankans have come out in unprecedented numbers to protest what they say is the gross mismanagement by the Rajapaksa government. So, what's likely to happen? Dr. Gehan Gunatilleke is a lawyer specializing in constitutional and human rights law. He joins us on the program to answer that question. Thank you for making the time.
Thanks for having me, Smitha.
The military and the police have been given emergency powers as of yesterday. That's Tuesday. What are these powers? And can you elaborate on your tweet from yesterday? You said this is absolutely extraordinary in a context where the country is demanding that the president resigns. Emergency regulations that further strengthen his powers have been issued.
So Smita, under the Public Security Ordinance, the president of the country has the power to declare a state of emergency and then bring certain provisions of that ordinance into operation. And under that ordinance, the president can issue emergency regulations, which can set out new offenses and give the president additional powers, right? So normally the mere declaration of an emergency doesn't have any impact on protesters, right? It is the issuing of emergency regulations that actually has made a difference. And last morning, emergency regulations were published and they were dated 6th May, so they've been in operation all this time. And there are extremely problematic provisions included in these regulations. I think they can be used against protesters. So far, no one has been arrested under the regulations to my knowledge, but it does give the opportunity and the space for protesters to be suppressed. For example, there's Regulation 11 that permits the president to prohibit the holding of processions or public meetings. Then there's also Regulation 15, which prohibits the spreading of false information or rumors on social media, which broadly speaking is likely to cause public alarm. Now, this is a very broad sort of phrase and it can cover a lot of things. So I think it is absolutely important that emergency is rescinded and the regulations are consequently discontinued so that people can resume their peaceful protest. I think while these regulations are in play, the right to peaceful assembly is in serious jeopardy. Now, let me elaborate on what I said in the tweet. While it is important that the Prime Minister has resigned, I think we are at risk of going one step forward and several steps back because emergency rule empowers the president in an unprecedented way. So the current president has just made himself extremely powerful under these emergency regulations. So this emergency, I think, is entirely incongruent with the political moment. The entire country is demanding the resignation of the president. And what does he do? He increases his powers. So that was the context in which I tweeted that sentiment.
Right. And even if nobody has been arrested, the chilling effect of such regulations is there for all to see. I mean, people do sort of self-censor, as you said. Potentially, they could be arrested for perhaps
Absolutely.
putting something out on social media.
Absolutely.
Um,
Absolutely. The risk is there now going forward. Yeah.
Right. Does all this mean that Gotabaya Rajapaksa is going to stay put, and is Sri Lanka likely heading towards martial law? I'm sort of going to elaborate on this. We've in this regard, I wanted to know what is the position of the Sri Lankan military. We heard from the Chief of Defence and Commander of the Army, General Shavendra Silva. I read a sort of a transcript of his press conference, and he seemed to assure the people of Sri Lanka of the neutrality of the armed forces. Now, in the face of this massive sort of public uprising, will General Silva stay aligned to President Gotabaya, or are we, as some are speculating, going to see the military perhaps lean on the president to step down?
Yeah, so I really don't know what the president will do next. All I can say is that the increase of presidential powers, including the power to appoint officers to positions of government agents to exercise administrative powers throughout the country, these regulations are in many ways unprecedented in that sense, right? It certainly does not reflect the measures of a person preparing to resign. So what the president will do is, of course, anyone's guess. But am not sure at all as to what the precise position of the military is, and perhaps a defense analyst is better positioned to comment on that. I don't think the military has given any clear indication of being partisan. I must say that. However, let's not forget that it is the president who is the commander in chief of the armed forces. And it's the president who is now exercising extraordinary emergency powers. So I find it hard to believe that the military would actively go against the office of the president when it is in the law itself that the law itself vests the president with these extraordinary powers. The problem has to be solved politically, and I think it's both unsustainable and dangerous to expect the military to play an active role rather other than protecting civilians, because that is the central role of the military in a crisis of this nature.
Right. I'll come to the question on the political stalemate in just a bit, but our viewers from India may not be familiar with the sort of governance structure that exists in Sri Lanka. So I'm reading a bit from what I've understood. Uh, the president, this is Sri Lanka has an executive presidency, which means Gotabaya Rajapaksa is directly elected by the people. But when Mahinda Rajapaksa resigned on Tuesday, and so did a majority of his cabinet, if I understand correctly, technically, does this mean that Sri Lanka is without a government as of today, or does Gotabaya Rajapaksa, is he both the head of state as also the head of government?
Well, yes, the president is both the head of state and the head of government, and that means he's the head of cabinet. But when a prime minister resigns, the cabinet automatically is dissolved, and the president is required immediately to appoint a member of parliament who, in his opinion, commands the confidence of parliament, and then appoint several others to a cabinet. This has to happen without delay. And the onus is on party leaders to present the president with a viable candidate to be prime minister. But until that happens, some may argue that the president can actually exercise residual executive powers with respect to all subjects and functions. And this is extremely dangerous, right? So he's already enhanced his powers by declaring a state of emergency and issuing emergency regulations. The lack of a cabinet and in fact parliament being adjourned at the moment, it makes the situation even more untenable. And I think the party leaders have a very clear obligation to quickly present a nominee, and they can no longer wait because the situation is very, very precarious and dangerous, precisely because emergency has been declared and all powers now are concentrated in a president.
But the numbers don't appear to stack up, do they? I mean, what is the way out of this political impasse? Because the largest opposition party, though not in a position to form a government on its own, has said that a unity government under this particular president is an absolute non-starter. So, in such a situation, you are faced with a constitutional sort of conundrum.
Absolutely, and there is no easy way out of it. But what needs to happen is fairly clear, right? There is no viable solution that can actually involve the current president continuing to hold office. Let's not forget that the headline demand of the people is very simple. It is for the president to resign. So there's no appeasing the people by having just the prime minister resign. The protest will continue until the president resigns. So an interim government with the current president as its head will lack any legitimacy amongst the people. So the opposition cannot possibly be associated with that kind of interim arrangement. But say the president does resign and someone else takes over, a fairly neutral figure, I think then the opposition can provide the government with confidence and supply so it can function until the election is called, until a general election that is called as soon as possible. I don't see any other way out of this impasse. So the president can dig his heels in, as you mentioned, but so did the prime minister. And I think it is important that the president resigns with dignity instead of doing what the prime minister did.
Right. Dr. Gunatilleke, one aspect that has, at least more than one public intellectual in India has sort of reflected on this. The fact that the importance of independent institutions in a situation like this becomes evident. I want to ask you about how independent institutions in Sri Lanka have acquitted themselves. I know the Attorney General, Sanjay Rajaratnam, has written to the IG of police asking for a thorough probe into an immediate probe into the violence that took place in Colombo, violence that was perpetrated reportedly by supporters of the Rajapaksas. Now, before you answer that question, for our viewers here in India, this is something akin to KK Venugopal, our Attorney General, writing to the Delhi police perhaps to probe violence perpetrated by supporters of the BJP in the Delhi riots. If that were to happen, it is significant, isn't it? Could you talk a little about it and about the other sort of independent institutions?
Absolutely, I think it's a welcome development. It's too early to really make your mind up as to whether institutions have somehow come out of the shadow of the 20th Amendment of the Constitution, which was passed in September, October 2020, immediately after Gotabaya Rajapaksa was elected, and then reinforced his sort of dominance at the general election almost a year later. What the 20th Amendment did was it concentrated powers of appointment in the president. And many political actors and analysts and scholars, civil society pointed to the fact that that would lead to the total politicization of institutions, right? So while the 20th Amendment continues to be in operation, there are limits on how independent a particular institution can be. Having said that, I think all institutional actors understand the political moment that we're in. They understand that there is no scope for error and they must signal their commitment to democratic values. So, accountability for the violence that we saw a couple of days ago has to be delivered. And it would be an absolute shame if there's only lip service being paid. I think the real action would require investigations, indictments, prosecutions, convictions, and we'll have to wait to see whether that really happens. So while these statements are very promising, it's too early to suggest that institutions have become truly independent. I think we have to see those concrete actions, the decisive actions taking place.
Right. Now, the question that follows is about a majority of the people in Sri Lanka. Now, Mahinda Rajapaksa and Gotabaya Rajapaksa have been revered in Sri Lanka by, I would say, particularly the Sinhala Buddhist majority. Now, these very cheerleaders of the Rajapaksa family, many of them, I understand, are out on the streets protesting the mismanagement of the Rajapaksas. Now, this sort of politics of muscular nationalism, which got a massive thumbs up in both elections, the presidential elections and subsequently the coalition that came to power, bringing Mahinda Rajapaksa in as prime minister. The protests are seeing people across ethnicities and across religions. I want to quote from something that the former chief of the Sri Lanka Human Rights Commission said. She said, "This moment of potential and promise needs to tackle Sinhala Buddhist nature of state that has enabled and led to discrimination of and violence against Tamils and Muslims." for decades. My question to you, Dr. Gunatilleke, is this indeed that day of reckoning for the majority Sinhala Buddhist community in Sri Lanka that may have sort of cheered on some of these um, policies by the Rajapaksas?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough question. It's a very important question, but I think it's important to understand that transforming majoritarianism doesn't happen in a month of protests. It will take a generation of undoing. I think entitlement complexes, existential fears that are embedded in the majority community. I think this is a moment that is certainly special, and it's extremely important to understand that. But it should not be confused for a moment that will produce sustainable intercommunal harmony, because this is, after all, an economic crisis and everyone is in the same boat. We will need to see whether the fault lines reappear when ethno-religious privilege becomes relevant again. Right now, I think the crisis, because it's economic, it does not discriminate. But there may be future events when our society is tested again. And I'm not ready to celebrate intercommunal solidarity and harmony just yet. I think there's a long way to go for that. And anyone who makes grand claims about that, I think, needs to conduct more thorough and thoughtful research on the subject. But having said that, I think there are some special moments worth talking about. When the Tamil version of the national anthem was not sung at Gotagogam at first, people pointed it out and it was immediately sung the next day. That's progress. I mean, small but still progress. Then last evening, when outside elements tried to incite violence against Sinhalese and Muslims in Negombo, the local residents resisted and refused to let the violence turn communal. These are little stories of hope and resilience, and they tell us that we might be able to learn from all of this, and not let ethno religious politics dominate our culture. And as you said, the Rajapaksas thrived on that kind of politics. So, with their rejection, perhaps comes a genuine opportunity for a culture change.
I'm not very familiar with the sort of principled position opposition parties had taken to this sort of wildly popular, as I said, Sinhala Buddhist majoritarian narrative. Can you sort of perhaps briefly talk about, is there a because these are the reason I ask you is because we're looking at you with some sort of hope. We are at the moment also sort of battling what has been this dominant majoritarian narrative in our country. Um, do you see a political party looking to take that space and perhaps capitalize on what has been a coming together of people and a rejection of the very powerful political family that stood for this sort of muscular nationalism politics?
I think there is a vacuum that's going to be created when the Rajapaksas get pushed out. And it's up to opposition political parties to fill that vacuum with something more sustainable, something that is normatively much more desirable than the opportunistic politics of the current government. The current government is a mix of both ideological commitment to majoritarianism and opportunism, right? And I think there are definitely elements on all sides which are opportunistic. And I think if opportunities present themselves to sort of signal majoritarian sort of values, or signal favoritism to one particular community, those opportunities may be taken by political parties in the future as well. So I'm not discounting the re-emergence of majoritarianism in the future, but I think we've all learned a lesson that it's not sustainable. And when you play into this kind of politics, you end up in the place that the Rajapaksas have found themselves. So I think any politician that can see the long term needs to firmly reject that brand of politics. But I think, unfortunately, all politicians on all sides tend to be opportunistic. And even if there is no ideological commitment to majoritarianism, we may see instances of opportunism in the future.
Two final questions, Dr. Gunatilleke. One is, I know that you study ethno-religious. I mean, as an academic, you're a researcher too. What does this moment sort of represent? I'm sure you're writing down, and perhaps there may be a book in the offing too. What does this moment sort of present itself as to you? I mean, as an academic, how do you reflect on the present developments from the in the context of what you've studied?
So, as I said before, I think this is a really important question, and it's definitely too early to make grand statements about what this moment actually represents. I would much rather see this moment play out, and see how resilient people are to ethno-religious politics and politicking, if I can put it that way, when the stakes are slightly different. Right now, everyone is in the same economic boat. So the need to play on ethno-religious fault lines will be immediately identified as opportunistic. And I think there is a rejection there. I was observing certain attempts by militant groups to turn the protests very early on, to turn the protests into something that is ethno-religious in nature and say that there are extremist elements behind them. And even the government played into that narrative very early on by describing, official sources were describing the protests outside Bilihan very early on as a sort of Arab Spring, and that extremists are involved. All of that did not stick because it just went against the common narrative that this is an economic crisis, that the entire country has been thrust into this crisis by a government that is callous, that is corrupt, that is incompetent. And so fault lines have not been at the forefront. But having said that, I think it is important to be cautious about one's optimism. This society still needs to be tested, and the resilience of particularly young people need to be seen. I'm particularly hopeful because I've seen these little hopeful events where resilience has been shown, and yesterday was a good example of that. If you view the footage and the images that went around, it was clear that the local residents of Negombo were very keen to reject that incitement, to make it about Sinhalese and Muslims. And I think that's very hopeful because we've seen ethno-religious violence in Negombo in the past, particularly in the aftermath of Easter Sunday. So I think that resilience and that resistance needs to be capitalized on, and these stories that are hopeful and positive need to be retold so it becomes part of the psyche and part of the public narrative. And space for militant groups to change that narrative has to be really constrained. So I'm hopeful, but I'm still cautiously optimistic.
Right. One final question about the elite in Sri Lanka. And this is of particular sort of interest to Indians. I don't know how much of Indian Twitter you follow, but when legendary cricketers like Sangakkara and Jayawardene tweeted, quote tweeted the president, I suppose, or about the violence or the political ruling political party, sort of telling them that listen to the voice of the people and this is not done, and they were hailed on Indian Twitter as people who have a spine. And Indian cricketers in particular have come under much criticism. They always play nice, is what is said. They don't really speak out against many sort of majoritarian moves that have been made by governments, state governments, and central. Is Are people like a Sangakkara? Are they generally outspoken, or is it the fact that the sort of public uprising is so overwhelming that sort of the elite of Sri Lanka feel the need to say that we're with you?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't follow specific actors and their public messaging close enough to know whether there's been a specific shift. But I think it's definitely fair to say that it's a good thing to see celebrities and particularly former and present cricketers speak out. And even at the protest site, Gota Gogama, you will bump into them, right? And I think their voices mean a lot to protesters, and they also add to the protection of ordinary civilians. When they speak out, there's a protection that is offered to everyone else. So they need to keep it up until the president resigns.
All right. Dr. Gehan Gunatilleke, I really appreciate your time and for helping us sort of understand what is a rapidly developing situation in Sri Lanka. We hope to touch base with you perhaps later in the week as well. Thank you for the moment.